the carbon cycle. In this video, scientists will be able to comprehend how humans are contributing to climate change by understanding the carbon cycle. First, let's take a look at the carbon cycle that existed before humans came along. I want you to pay special attention to the atmospheric CO2 dial in the top left of the diagram. That dial will tell you if there is too much or too little CO2 in the atmosphere. Next, let's talk about the sources of CO2, or things that add CO2, and we'll put that in orange. The first source is from animals. You know that as animals breathe out, they release CO2. In addition to animals breathing out, things that are decomposing, like the log, release CO2. But the biggest source of CO2 actually comes from oceans. They release CO2 naturally. In addition to adding CO2, nature removes CO2. Plants are one really great sink of CO2. Plants remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so do oceans. It turns out that oceans are the biggest remover of CO2 on Earth. So we saw in that diagram that nature had sort of formed a natural balance. Carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere and being removed from the atmosphere was in balance, and that needle of atmospheric carbon dioxide wasn't moving. Which begs the question, where does the extra carbon dioxide come from? Now, it's important to know a few things about carbon dioxide. The first is that carbon dioxide is made out of carbon and oxygen. Now, oxygen is readily available in the atmosphere, but what is carbon? Turns out carbon is an atom, and that every living thing on Earth is made of carbon, and we're talking lots of carbon. Living organisms can be upwards of 30 or 40% carbon, and plants can be as much as 50% carbon. So to make living things requires a lot of carbon. Now keep that in mind, because there was living things way before humans. In fact, if you go back to the time before dinosaurs, and we're talking 300 to 400 million years ago, there was vast areas of swamps and oceans. Now, thinking about those swamps were huge areas of plants. And those plants lived and died. And the same thing happened in the ocean. There was abundant ocean life, and those things lived and died. And over time, the remains of those plants and animals got buried under layers of dirt and sand and silt. And what happened is the layer of sort of dead carbon material got squished down by dirt and soil. And given enough time and pressure, those organic remains, the remains of plants and animals, was changed. The bodies of plants and animals turned into fossil fuels. And that is crazy to think about. There is a layer of coal under some spots of the world, and the carbon that makes up that coal used to be old plants in a swamp 300 million years ago. Similarly, in the oceans, there are pockets of oil and gas that are made from the carbon of plants and animals that lived in the ocean 300 to 400 million years ago. And in both examples, that layer of dead plants and animals was squished by layer after layer of dirt, sand, and soil. And given enough time, the carbon in their bodies turned into fossil fuels. Now here's the thing, those fossil fuels were buried underground. That carbon was kind of locked underground. The carbon had no way of getting into the atmosphere until clever humans figured out how to dig up or pump up those fossil fuels, and we found out that fossil fuels make for a really excellent energy source. Fossil fuels can be used to make oil and natural gas and coal. And all three of those things, if you burn them, make energy. And that's what humans have been doing. Humans have been using fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal, to create the energy that powers our lives. And again, how do we get that energy? Well, we have to go out into the earth, dig down into the earth, and extract those fossil fuels. And remember, those fossil fuels are made mostly of carbon, because living things are mostly carbon. So we dug up the remains of dead plants and animals, and we've been burning them. When we burn those fossil fuels, we get energy, but we also release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So let's take a look at the carbon cycle again, but this time with the addition of humans in the equation. Again, I want you to pay attention to that atmospheric CO2 dial in the top left. One way that humans contribute to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is through the generation of power. We have power plants that burn fossil fuels to create electricity. In addition, we have factories that rely on fossil fuels to make the things that we all love and enjoy, and they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere too. In addition, things like transportation and farming all create carbon dioxide as part of our modern lives. And so just like nature adds CO2, creating electricity adds CO2, the manufacturing of goods creates CO2, transportation, cars, boats, and planes create CO2, and modern farming creates CO2. So here's your two big takeaways. The carbon cycle has always existed. Before humans were around, nature had formed a really delicate balance. Carbon dioxide that was released into the atmosphere was absorbed back out of the atmosphere, and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere stayed the same. CO2 was added and removed at the same rate. However, in the past 200 years, since humans have figured out how to use fossil fuels for energy, well, nature has continued to add and remove CO2, but humans have now been pumping CO2 into the atmosphere without removing any of that carbon dioxide. So here's your key ideas. Nature had formed a balance of CO2, and there was large stores of carbon underground that we call fossil fuels. Humans, however, have been burning those fossil fuels and have added carbon dioxide. Because humans do not remove CO2 from the atmosphere, the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere have continued and will continue to rise.